What would you do if everything you loved was stripped away in one night? Emily never imagined that her future would be sold to a stranger, a man who spoke in silence and carried shadows in his heart. Behind the grand walls of Thorn Manor, secrets fester, and trust is a dangerous game. But even in the darkest places, a single spark can ignite a fire. Follow Emily's journey through betrayal, mystery, and a love she never saw coming. A story where nothing is what it first appears. Stay close. The truth is just beginning to unfold. If you closed your eyes and listened closely, you could almost hear it. The soft laughter of a life untouched by sorrow. Emily's world was a small one, tucked away at the edge of a forgotten village, where the mornings smelled of wildflowers, and the nights whispered with the songs of crickets. There were no high towers, no flashing lights, no hunger for ambition. Just simple lives, simple hearts, and simple dreams. Emily had lived 17 gentle years inside this cocoon of innocence. Her days were spent tending the family's modest garden, helping her mother bake warm loaves of bread, and losing herself in old, battered books where love always found a way. She wore hand-stitched dresses, soft and faded with time, and her only jewelry was a tiny silver cross her grandmother had given her when she was a child. Everything about her spoke of a quiet life. A life that believed, foolishly perhaps, that kindness would always be enough to keep the darkness away. Her beauty was unintentional, a byproduct of her sincerity. Wide blue eyes that reflected every emotion, a soft smile that made you feel forgiven even before you asked, and hair the color of wheat fields kissed by the summer sun. But it wasn't her face that drew people to her. It was the purity she carried, a light so rare in a world that had long since learned how to lie. The villagers adored Emily. A sweet angel, they called her when she passed, balancing baskets of vegetables on her hip. Old women would pinch her cheeks fondly. Young boys would sneak glances at her from behind market stalls, too shy to meet her gaze. She was, in every sense, the village's precious daughter. The living proof that innocence could still survive if only you protected it enough. But innocence, as the cruel world knows too well, is a fragile thing. It can be treasured, it can be hidden, it can even be loved, but it cannot be saved forever. There were signs, of course, little fractures in the perfection of her world. Emily sometimes caught her parents exchanging worried glances when they thought she wasn't looking. Her father, once a jovial man who sang old sea shanties while carving wooden toys, had grown quieter these past months. Her mother, who used to hum softly while kneading dough, now spent long hours in silence, her hands wringing the same cloth over and over, as if trying to squeeze the worry out of it. Still, Emily, sweet, trusting Emily, thought little of it. After all, how could anything bad find her here, among the gentle hills and golden fields? If she had known. If only she had known. One late afternoon, as the sky melted into a dreamy pink, Emily sat by the river, her bare feet skimming the cool water, her mind floating in daydreams about futures spun from nothing but hope. A hand-stitched journal rested on her lap, its pages filled with sketches of wildflowers and clumsy poems about love she had never known, but always believed she would find. Someday, somehow. Her favorite fantasy was simple. A kind man, not rich nor powerful, but warm-hearted and strong. Someone who would laugh with her, work the land with her, and build a life as humble and sweet as the one she already knew. She imagined children, lots of them, chasing chickens in the yard, shouting and laughing under a sun that never stopped shining. It was the kind of dream that only a girl like Emily could hold on to without irony, the kind of dream that, in another world, might have come true. But the sky that evening, though painted in soft colors, seemed somehow heavier, as if the heavens themselves mourned something already lost. At dinner that night, the house was quiet. Too quiet. The stew that simmered on the table went untouched longer than usual. Emily noticed her father's hands trembling slightly as he passed her a slice of bread. Her mother's smile, usually so easy and warm, felt stretched and brittle, like glass ready to shatter. "Emily," her father began, his voice low and uneven. She looked up, tilting her head with innocent curiosity. "Yes, Papa?" He exchanged a glance with her mother, a glance so thick with sorrow that Emily's stomach twisted without understanding why. "There's someone we want you to meet," her mother said finally, her voice cracking. "Meet?" Emily repeated, her heart skipping for reasons she couldn't explain. "A good man," her father added quickly. "A man who can offer you a better life, a future, stability." The words felt strange in her ears, alien and heavy. Wasn't her life already good? Wasn't this simple world enough? "But I'm happy here," she whispered. Her father's eyes turned glassy, and for a terrifying moment Emily realized he was fighting back tears. "It's what's best for you," he said. "Trust us." And because she was Emily, sweet, obedient, trusting Emily, she swallowed the lump rising in her throat and nodded, even as her heart screamed a silent, desperate "no." That night, lying awake in her small bed under the patchwork quilt her grandmother had sewn by hand, Emily stared at the ceiling, her mind racing for the first time in her young life. Fear was a foreign language on her tongue. Uncertainty gnawed at her like a slow, invisible worm. Outside her window the wind shifted, whispering secrets through the trees, and somewhere, far beyond the hills she had never crossed, a man she had never met was preparing to change her life forever. Tomorrow, Emily would be given away. Not with joy, not with celebration, but with quiet resignation, like a flower plucked too early from the soil. And nothing, would ever be the same again. The sun rose pale and uncertain over the village the next morning, as if even it hesitated to witness what was about to unfold. Emily sat quietly at the breakfast table, her hands curled around a chipped mug of lukewarm tea she barely tasted. Her parents moved around her in a strange choreography, their actions mechanical, their smiles forced. There was an invisible weight pressing down on the room, a sorrow so thick it seemed to muffle even the birdsong outside. She wanted to ask, to beg, for answers. Who was this man? Why now? Why her? But the words clung to the walls of her throat, paralyzed by fear and loyalty. Instead, she watched, listened, and it was in the small things. The hurried whisper between her mother and father in the hallway, the tight way her father's hand gripped the doorknob, that Emily first understood. This was not a blessing. It was a debt. Later that day, as the villagers bustled about the town square, Emily wandered through the narrow streets, clutching a worn basket she no longer had the heart to fill. Familiar faces smiled at her, but their smiles were tinged with something else now, something sad. It was as if everyone knew, but no one dared to speak it aloud. Mrs. Cartwright, the old seamstress, paused in hemming a dress to watch Emily pass. Her wrinkled hands trembled slightly over the fabric. Old Mr. Hayes, who had taught Emily how to fish when she was a little girl, tipped his hat low over his eyes, avoiding her gaze altogether. Whispers followed her like shadows. "Poor thing. No choice, really. Better this than starving." The words sliced into her heart with cold precision, even though she could barely catch them through the rushing sound of blood in her ears. It wasn't just her parents' burden. It was the village's burden, too. In a place where survival was a daily battle against drought, sickness, and poverty, there was no room for dreams, no place for sweet girls who spent too much time sketching wildflowers and imagining love. Emily wasn't being given away because she wasn't loved. She was being given away because she was loved, and love here meant sacrifice. As she wandered aimlessly past the familiar sights, the bakery where she once snuck pastries, the cobbled bridge where she learned to skip stones, Emily felt the walls of her world closing in. She found herself drawn to the small chapel at the end of the road, its white paint peeling, its wooden doors forever slightly ajar. Inside, the air was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of candle wax and old wood. Dust motes floated lazily in the beams of sunlight slanting through the stained glass windows. Emily sank onto the last pew, pressing her hands together so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She didn't pray for escape. She didn't pray for a miracle. She prayed for courage. "Please," she whispered in the silence, "please help me to be brave." Tears blurred her vision, and for the first time she allowed herself to cry. Not loud, racking sobs, but silent, trembling tears that dripped onto her dress unnoticed. There, in that tiny chapel, Emily said goodbye to the girl she had been. The girl who believed that good things came to those who waited, who trusted that the world was a kind and patient place. The world was not kind. The world was not patient. The world was about to tear her away from everything she knew, and all she could do was go. By the time Emily returned home, the sky was growing heavy with twilight, casting long, mournful shadows across the dirt path leading to her front door. Parked at the edge of the lane was a dark carriage she didn't recognize. Polished black wood, heavy wheels, and a crest she had never seen before emblazoned on the side. Her heart dropped into her stomach. This was it. Without realizing it, Emily's steps slowed, then stopped altogether. Her hands trembled at her sides. Standing by the door was her father, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. Her mother hovered nearby, wringing her hands in the apron she wore every day. And beside them, towering, foreign, impossibly out of place, was a man. Not a boy from the village, not a kind-faced farmer's son. A man. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in somber, expensive clothes. His dark hair was neatly combed back, his features sharp and unsmiling. He was not old, but he was old enough to seem like another species entirely compared to Emily's soft, girlish innocence. His eyes, cold, assessing, locked onto her the moment she appeared, and the air between them seemed to freeze. This was not the face of a rescuer. This was not the face of a dream come true. It was the face of reality, hard, unyielding, inescapable. Her father stepped forward, clearing his throat. His voice cracked when he spoke. "Emily," he said, forcing a trembling smile. "This is Mr. Alexander Thorne." Alexander Thorne. A name that sounded like the closing of a heavy iron gate. Emily's fingers twisted into the fabric of her skirt as she lowered her gaze, fighting the urge to run, to scream, to plead. Instead, she curtsied, her body moving on muscle memory, the way she had been taught since childhood. "Sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible. There was a pause, a long, suffocating pause. Then Alexander inclined his head stiffly, offering no smile, no comfort. Only a hand extended toward her. Not inviting, not tender, but expectant. It was not a hand offered to an equal. It was a hand offered to something purchased. And Emily, heart-pounding, stomach-twisting, stepped forward. Because she had no choice. Because sometimes love looks like sacrifice. And sometimes sacrifice looks like surrender. The walls of Emily's home had never felt so small. As she sat rigidly on the edge of the couch, the same couch where she once napped after long days in the fields, she barely registered the familiar sights around her. The faded quilt thrown over the armchair, the clock ticking softly on the wall, the scent of fresh bread cooling in the kitchen. Everything was the same, and yet everything was different. Alexander Thorne stood by the window, his silhouette etched against the sinking sun. He said little. Only a few curt words to her father, a few clipped nods toward her mother. He did not look at Emily again. Her parents tried to fill the heavy silence with empty pleasantries, asking about the weather, the journey, the condition of the roads. But their voices wavered, brittle and thin, as if they could shatter at the slightest touch. Emily sat there, her hands folded neatly in her lap, the picture of a well-mannered daughter. Inside she was crumbling. At last, Alexander turned. "I would like to conclude our arrangement tonight," he said, his voice deep, polished, and devoid of any warmth. Emily's stomach twisted painfully. Her mother gasped softly. Her father cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "We thought," he began, glancing at Emily, "that perhaps she could stay with us for another week. To prepare." Alexander's mouth tightened. "Preparation is unnecessary. The documents are signed. The dowry has been paid." His gaze flickered to Emily, a glance that weighed heavily on her chest, branding her without a single touch. She wasn't a daughter anymore. She wasn't a girl. She was a transaction. A bitter knot of shame and fear tangled inside her, choking her breath. Her father, shoulders sagging with defeat, nodded slowly. "Of course," he whispered. And just like that, the final thread of her old life snapped. The hours that followed blurred into a surreal haze. Emily was instructed to pack a small bag. Just a few dresses, some personal trinkets. Nothing of real weight or meaning. Her mother brushed her hair for the last time, silent tears slipping down her cheeks. "My sweet girl," she whispered, pressing a worn ribbon into Emily's trembling hand. Promise me you'll find a way to be happy." Emily couldn't speak. She could only nod, pressing the ribbon to her chest like a lifeline. Her father hugged her fiercely, his hands rough with years of labor, his heart breaking right there in his arms. "I'm sorry," he murmured against her hair. "I'm so sorry." But sorrow wasn't enough to stop what was already in motion. Outside the carriage waited, a black maw ready to swallow her whole. When Emily stepped out into the cool night air, a shiver raced down her spine. The stars overhead seemed distant, cold, indifferent to the tiny human tragedy unfolding below. Alexander stood beside the carriage door, his posture straight, his expression carved in stone. He didn't offer a hand to help her up. He didn't offer a single word of comfort. Emily climbed into the carriage alone, the hem of her simple dress brushing the cold metal step. Her parents stood together on the porch, their arms wrapped around each other, watching helplessly as the coachman snapped the reins. The wheels lurched forward, crunching over the dirt path. Emily didn't look back. She couldn't. Because if she did, she might never have the strength to let go. The journey away from her village stretched endlessly through the night. Inside the carriage, the silence was unbearable. Emily sat rigid, her hands clutching the ribbon her mother had given her, her mind a chaotic whirl of fear and grief. Alexander said nothing. He sat opposite her, his eyes occasionally catching the flickering lantern light, revealing fleeting glimpses of a man who was as much a prisoner of his own silence as Emily was of her fate. Hours passed. The fields gave way to forests, then hills, then open, empty land where no homes or hearths broke the horizon. It felt as though they were journeying to another world entirely, one where hope did not exist. At some point, exhaustion pulled at Emily's body, but fear kept her awake. Every bump of the carriage wheels, every howl of the wind outside, tightened the knot in her chest. Where were they going? What was waiting for her at the end of this road? She dared a glance at Alexander. He sat still, staring out the window, his jaw tight, his hands gloved and clenched loosely on his knees. Not a villain, not a savior. Something else, something worse. A man who had learned to bury his heart so deeply that no one could ever touch it again. Hours later, how many Emily could no longer tell, the carriage finally slowed. Peering through the fogged glass, Emily caught sight of a massive estate looming in the distance, silhouetted against the pale moonlight. Tall iron gates guarded the entrance, their black bars twisted like skeletal fingers reaching skyward. Beyond them, the mansion itself sprawled like a beast sleeping restlessly in the dark. Towers and wings extended in every direction, windows staring out like hollow, watching eyes. It was beautiful in the way a thunderstorm is beautiful, awe-inspiring, terrifying, impossible to control. Emily's heart pounded so loudly she feared Alexander might hear it. The carriage passed through the gates with a groan of old metal. The gravel road crunched beneath the wheels as they wound through an overgrown garden that had long since surrendered to wildness. At last, the carriage halted before the front steps. Alexander opened the door himself and stepped down, then turned, waiting silently. Emily hesitated, just for a breath, then gathered her skirt and descended into the cool night. The moment her feet touched the ground, something inside her shifted. There was no going back now. The life she had known was over. Standing in the shadows of a mansion she had never seen, beside a man she didn't know, Emily realized something bone-deep and irrevocable. She was utterly, completely alone. The heavy oak doors creaked open with a low groan, as if even the house itself hesitated to welcome her. Emily stepped inside, her small figure swallowed by the sheer immensity of the entrance hall. Marble floors stretched out beneath her feet, polished to a cold, heartless gleam. Chandeliers dripped from the vaulted ceilings like frozen tears, their crystals glittering in the dim light. This was not a home. This was a monument, built to impress, not to comfort. Alexander moved ahead without waiting for her, his long strides carrying him deeper into the mansion. Emily hesitated at the threshold, the chill of the stones seeping up through the thin soles of her shoes. No one greeted them. No servants, no family, no welcoming fires. Only silence, vast and suffocating. Gathering what little courage she had left, Emily clutched the small bag of belongings against her chest and followed. He led her through hallways lined with oil paintings of grim-faced ancestors and heavy, oppressive furniture. Every step echoed eerily, as if even her soft footfalls disturbed the centuries of loneliness embedded in these walls. Finally, they reached a door, tall, dark, and closed tight. Alexander paused, his hand on the handle, and for the first time, he turned to truly look at her. His gaze was sharp, assessing, as if measuring every inch of her. Not with desire, not with tenderness, but with the cold calculation of a man inspecting a rare object he had acquired. Emily met his eyes, forcing herself not to flinch, and what she saw there made her breath catch in her throat. It wasn't cruelty. It wasn't lust. It was something far more devastating: emptiness. The eyes that met hers were voids, deep and dark, like wells that had long since run dry. No joy, no kindness, no hope, just exhaustion. Just resignation. Alexander Thorne was a man who had long ago stopped expecting anything good from the world, and perhaps had stopped believing he deserved anything good himself. "You'll stay here," he said, his voice quiet but firm, as he pushed the door open. The room beyond was modest, a stark contrast to the rest of the house. A small bed tucked neatly against one wall, a narrow wardrobe, a simple desk by the window which looked out onto an overgrown garden choked with weeds and thorns. It was not a prison cell, but it was close enough. Emily stepped inside, her heart heavy. "This will be your space," Alexander continued, standing stiffly in the doorway. "You are free to move about the house as you please. However," his voice dropped slightly, his eyes narrowing, "there are rooms that are locked. Do not attempt to enter them." The warning hung between them like smoke. Emily nodded mutely. He lingered a moment longer, studying her with that same hollow gaze, then turned away without another word. The door clicked softly behind him, and just like that, Emily was alone again. She sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping slightly under her weight. Everything felt too large. The bed, the room, the future. She pressed her hands into her lap to stop them from trembling, staring at the cracked, faded wallpaper peeling slightly in the corners. In her village, silence had been a comfort. The gentle hush of nature, the lulling quiet of safety. Here, silence was a threat. It pressed against her ears, amplifying every creak of the floorboards, every distant groan of the ancient house. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. "You have to be strong," she told herself. "You have to survive." And somehow she knew that survival here would not depend on strength alone. It would depend on understanding Alexander Thorne. Later, as the night deepened and the moon bathed the mansion in cold silver light, Emily ventured cautiously out into the hallway. She wandered aimlessly, her bare feet silent on the marble floors. At the end of the corridor she found a tall window overlooking the front drive. And there, standing in the shadows, almost hidden from sight, was Alexander. He stood perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back, his face turned toward the night. Something about his posture, so rigid, so full of invisible weight, stirred an unexpected ache in Emily's chest. He looked like a man carved out of stone, a monument to suffering. For the first time, Emily wondered what had made him this way. What had broken him so thoroughly that even a simple act of kindness seemed impossible now? The questions fluttered in her mind like moths around a dying flame. And even though fear still coiled in her belly, something deeper began to stir beneath it. Something softer. Something dangerously close to compassion. Because Emily, despite everything, had always believed that even broken things could be mended. Even broken hearts. Even Alexander Thorne. Morning arrived not with the gentle warmth Emily had known all her life, but with a cold gray light that seeped through the cracked curtains like an unwelcome guest. She sat on the narrow bed, already dressed in a plain, modest gown that hung loosely from her thin frame. Her small bag rested at her feet, half unpacked but untouched. There was nothing left to arrange, nothing left to prepare. Her old life was already gone. A soft knock sounded at the door. Emily stiffened. For a fleeting, foolish second she imagined it was her mother, come to whisk her away, to tell her it had all been a terrible mistake. But reality, once again, was merciless. It was not her mother. It was Mrs. Hathaway, an older woman with a pinched face and downturned mouth, who had introduced herself the night before as the housekeeper. She didn't meet Emily's eyes as she entered, carrying a tray with dry bread, butter, and weak tea. "You'll be expected downstairs in an hour," Mrs. Hathaway said brusquely, setting the tray down with a clatter. "The master will speak with you before the day begins." The master. The words lodged like thorns in Emily's heart. She nodded numbly. The housekeeper hesitated then, glancing once at Emily with something like pity flickering in her sharp eyes. But whatever kindness she might have offered shriveled quickly beneath years of servitude and silence. Without another word, she left, closing the door with a soft but definitive click. Emily forced herself to eat, though every bite turned to ash in her mouth. Then, with trembling hands, she tied back her golden hair with the faded ribbon her mother had given her, the last tangible piece of the world she had lost. When the clock struck 8, she rose, smoothing her dress, and made her way down the endless hallways to the grand staircase. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if unseen hands were trying to pull her backward, to keep her clinging to a life that no longer existed. At the bottom of the stairs, Alexander waited. He wore a crisp black suit, immaculate and severe, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. His face was as unreadable as ever, a marble sculpture of control. Emily descended, her heart thudding painfully against her ribs. When she reached the final step, he gave a small nod. Not of approval, not of welcome, merely acknowledgement. "Follow me," he said. He led her into a large sitting room filled with heavy furniture and heavy silence. The air smelled faintly of dust and something older, something harder to name. Despair, perhaps, or broken promises. Alexander gestured to a chair opposite a massive desk. Emily sat. He remained standing, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the room. "There are expectations," he began, his voice low and detached. "You will be cared for, fed, clothed, sheltered. In return, I expect obedience, respect, discretion. His eyes locked onto hers, cold and unwavering. You are not a prisoner, he continued, but neither are you free to do as you please. This arrangement benefits both of us. Understand? Emily nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Good. He paused, as if weighing his next words carefully. There are rooms you are forbidden to enter, he reminded her. There are questions you are forbidden to ask. Another pause. Another look. And there are parts of this house, he said, voice dropping lower, where memories live that are best left untouched. Emily swallowed hard, the air thick and choking. I understand, she whispered. Something flickered in his eyes then. A brief flash of sadness? Regret? But it was gone before she could be sure. Alexander straightened, returning to his cold, distant mask. You may go. Dismissed like a servant, Emily rose and curtsied instinctively, the old manners drilled into her from childhood rising unbidden to the surface. As she turned to leave, she heard him speak once more, almost too softly to catch. Welcome home, Emily. The words should have been comforting. They were not. They sounded like a eulogy. Emily wandered the hallways aimlessly after that, numb and weightless, like a ghost haunting a house she did not belong to. The mansion stretched endlessly in every direction. Endless corridors, endless closed doors, endless reminders that this was no place for dreams. She found herself drawn to a small courtyard hidden at the heart of the estate. It was overgrown, wild with tangled ivy and cracked stone paths, but there was a kind of quiet beauty to it, a memory of life clinging stubbornly to decay. In the center stood a dry, crumbling fountain. Once it must have been grand, a centerpiece of laughter and gatherings and life. Now it was silent, abandoned. Much like herself, Emily sat on the edge of the fountain, running her fingers over the rough stone, her mind drifting back to the village, to the riverbank, to her mother's gentle touch and her father's booming laugh. 1,000 small things she would never have again. And in that courtyard, beneath a sky that seemed too large and too empty, Emily said her final goodbye. She didn't cry. There were no tears left, only silence. A silent farewell to everything she had been, everything she had hoped to be. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the cracked stones. Emily stood, brushing the dust from her skirt. Somewhere inside the mansion, Alexander moved through the halls like a living ghost, just as trapped as she was in a life neither of them had chosen willingly. Maybe, she thought, we are not so different after all. But the thought brought little comfort. Because in this place, hope was as fragile as a spider's web, beautiful to dream about, but destroyed by the faintest touch of reality. And Emily had learned, far too soon, that dreams here died in silence. Just like everything else. At night, the mansion breathed. Not like a living thing, but like something ancient and restless. The low groans of settling wood, the whisper of distant drafts threading through unseen cracks. Emily lay in the narrow bed, her hands folded over the thin blanket, staring up at the high-shadowed ceiling. Sleep refused to come. The cold in the house was not the kind that could be chased away by blankets or fires. It lived in the very stones, deep and bitter, as if the walls themselves had absorbed every sorrow, every unspoken word ever uttered inside them. And now it had set its teeth into Emily too. The next morning, Mrs. Hathaway appeared once more to escort Emily to breakfast. No words of comfort, no warmth. The dining room was vast and cavernous, the kind of place where voices should have echoed with laughter and conversation. Instead, only the faint clatter of silverware disturbed the air. Alexander sat at the head of the long table, dressed impeccably as always, a newspaper folded neatly beside his plate. Emily took her place halfway down the table, the distance between them feeling like a yawning canyon. The meal was simple but meticulously prepared: soft-boiled eggs, warm bread, fruit preserves. Emily ate in silence, every movement careful, mechanical. Alexander barely glanced at her. No questions, no conversation, just the scraping of forks against china and the ticking of an old grandfather clock in the corner. It was as if two strangers were pretending to play house, trapped in a performance neither of them believed in. After breakfast, Mrs. Hathaway showed Emily more of the house. The library, a grand, towering room with dusty books lining the shelves, untouched for years. The music room, where a cracked grand piano sat beneath a heavy tarp. The gallery, filled with portraits whose painted eyes followed her wherever she moved, judging, accusing. But it was the locked doors that stayed with her most. There were so many of them. Wooden doors with heavy iron handles bolted tight. Rooms Emily was forbidden to enter. Secrets sealed away, festering in the dark. At each locked door, Mrs. Hathaway would simply frown and shake her head, guiding Emily firmly away. Emily didn't ask questions. She already knew the answers would hurt. Days blurred together after that, each one a hollow echo of the one before. Breakfasts in silence. Aimless wandering through the endless halls. Empty, meaningless afternoons spent sitting in forgotten parlors or staring blankly out rain-streaked windows. The staff, what little there was, moved like ghosts, avoiding her eyes, speaking only when necessary. It was as if the entire house was caught in a spell of quiet despair, and Emily had become just another piece of it. She learned to move carefully, to speak only when spoken to never push too hard against the invisible walls that hemmed her in. It was not fear that kept her compliant. It was the deep, gnawing loneliness. Loneliness so profound it hollowed her out from the inside, leaving only the shell of a girl who once dreamed of wildflowers and riverbanks. One evening, wandering through a seldom-used wing of the mansion, Emily stumbled upon a small, hidden room. It was a conservatory, though the glass ceiling was cracked and the plants inside had long since withered to dry, twisted husks. The scent of decay filled the air, rich and earthy and strangely beautiful. Emily stepped inside, her footsteps crunching softly on the broken stone floor. In the center stood a single living thing, a rose bush, wild and untamed, clinging stubbornly to life despite the neglect. It was covered in thorns, its few surviving blooms pale and bruised, but it still lived, still fought. Emily knelt before it, her fingers brushing lightly against a damaged petal. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, a tiny flicker of something stirred inside her. Not hope, not yet, but defiance. The quiet, stubborn refusal to disappear. Just like this wounded rose, she would endure. She would not let this place, or Alexander Thorne, erase her completely. That night, returning to her room, Emily passed by a grand staircase leading up into the darkened east wing, the one area she had never been shown. A heavy velvet rope blocked the steps, as if trying to keep the past from bleeding into the present. At the top, she thought she saw movement, a shadow shifting in the gloom. Her heart thudded painfully. Curiosity prickled at her, sharp and dangerous. What lived up there? What had Alexander hidden away so deeply that even the house itself seemed to shy from it? Emily knew better than to climb those stairs, knew that the locked doors were locked for a reason. And yet some part of her understood. If she ever wanted to truly survive here, not just exist, she would need to understand the man who had bought her freedom, and her soul, even if it meant walking straight into the heart of the darkness he tried so hard to bury. There were no locks on her door, no iron bars at her windows, no shouted orders or threats of violence. And yet Emily had never felt more trapped. The mansion was a vast, silent labyrinth, and Emily was its most reluctant resident. A living ornament tucked away behind heavy curtains and dust-covered chandeliers. Free to walk its endless halls. Free to sit alone in its cavernous rooms. Free, but only within invisible walls she dared not cross. Days bled into nights, and nights into endless, heavy mornings. Each sunrise brought with it a crushing sense of sameness, as if time itself refused to move forward inside these stone walls. Alexander remained distant, more shadow than man. Sometimes Emily glimpsed him in the library, flipping through ancient books he never seemed to read. Sometimes she heard the soft click of his boots echoing down the hall as he retreated into one of the locked wings. Always alone, always unreachable. They shared meals, always silent. They crossed paths, always guarded. It was as if an invisible glass pane separated them, allowing them to see each other but never to touch, never to truly connect. One morning, after yet another breakfast eaten without a single word exchanged, Emily stood at the window of her small room, watching the rain fall in sheets across the barren gardens. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass. Pale, thin, unfamiliar. Is this who I'm becoming? She wondered. Just another ghost in this house of grief? A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. It was Mrs. Hathaway, her hands folded primly before her. "The master requests your presence in the east parlor," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. Emily's heart skipped a beat. It was rare for Alexander to summon her directly. Wiping her damp palms against her skirt, she followed the housekeeper through the dimly lit hallways. The east parlor was smaller than the grand halls she usually wandered, more intimate, though no less cold. A small fire burned in the hearth, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. Alexander stood by the window, his back to her. "You wish to see me?" Emily asked softly, her voice cracking from disuse. He turned, his face set in its usual mask of indifference. "I have business to attend to in the city," he said. "I will be gone for several days." Emily blinked, unsure how to respond. "You will remain here," he continued, his tone brooking no argument. "You are not to leave the grounds. You are not to speak with strangers." His eyes hardened slightly. "You are not to enter the east wing." The east wing. The forbidden staircase. Emily lowered her gaze, feeling the invisible chains tighten around her ankles. "I understand," she whispered. Alexander studied her for a long moment, so long that the silence became suffocating. Then, almost imperceptibly, his expression shifted. A flicker of something, guilt, sadness, fear, crossed his features before disappearing beneath the familiar armor. "I will return soon," he said, softer this time. And before she could summon the courage to ask him why he treated her like a fragile, dangerous secret, he was gone. The house felt even heavier without him. Not because she missed his presence, but because without his silent, brooding figure roaming the halls, there was nothing left to distract her from her own growing despair. Emily wandered the mansion like a forgotten ghost. Sometimes she sat for hours in the empty library, tracing the worn spines of books too brittle to touch. Sometimes she stood in the crumbling conservatory, staring at the struggling rosebush and wondering if it, too, longed for escape. The days stretched endlessly, blurring at the edges, and at night, in the suffocating dark, Emily dreamed of running, of sprinting barefoot across the wet fields beyond the estate, of breaking through the heavy iron gates and vanishing into the mist. But every time she woke, the same realization crushed her chest. There was nowhere to run. Not truly. She had no money. No family who could, or would, take her back. No future waiting for her beyond these cold walls. Her freedom had been traded away the moment her parents shook Alexander Thorne's hand. And now, invisible though they were, the chains that bound her were stronger than steel. One evening, as the rain lashed against the windows and the wind howled like a wounded animal, Emily found herself once again standing at the foot of the east wing staircase. The velvet rope hung there still, frayed, sagging, ineffectual. Beyond it, the stairs rose into shadow, disappearing into forbidden gloom. She should turn away. She should return to her room, close her door, and pretend she had never been tempted. But something deeper, something desperate, gnawed at her. She needed to understand. needed to know what terrible secrets Alexander had hidden behind those locked doors, needed to believe that there was a reason, a human reason, for the cold prison her life had become. Emily placed a trembling hand on the dusty banister, and for the first time she took a step forward. The east wing smelled of old secrets. Emily ascended the staircase slowly, every creak of the worn steps echoing like a gunshot in the silence. The air grew colder the higher she climbed, and the dim light from the main hall faded into deep, oppressive shadows. She paused at the top, her breath misting slightly in the chill. Before her stretched a long corridor lined with closed doors, each one dark and foreboding. The wallpaper peeled in jagged strips. Dust clung to every surface. The floor was littered with the forgotten debris of a life once lived and long abandoned. She knew she shouldn't be here. She knew Alexander had forbidden it. But curiosity, loneliness, and something deeper, something dangerously close to empathy, pulled her forward. Step by step, she moved down the hall. Each door she passed seemed to hum with a silent warning. Leave. Go back. And yet she kept walking, until she reached the door at the very end of the corridor. It was slightly ajar. With trembling fingers, Emily pushed it open. The room beyond was large, but suffocatingly intimate. A study, once elegant, now coated in dust and sorrow. Heavy curtains blocked most of the light. The fireplace was cold and crumbling. Shelves lined the walls, their contents untouched. At the center of the room sat a battered armchair facing the fireplace, and there, slumped low in the chair, one hand hanging loosely over the side, was Alexander Thorne. Emily's heart lurched painfully in her chest. He didn't hear her, or if he did, he made no sign of it. He sat perfectly still, his head bowed, his hair falling over his eyes. On the small table beside him stood a half-empty glass of dark liquor and an old, worn photograph. Emily inched closer, the floor groaning beneath her weight. She could see now that the photograph was of a woman, young, beautiful, her smile radiant with the kind of effortless joy Emily barely remembered from her own past. She held a small child in her arms, a boy no older than 2 or 3, with messy dark hair and bright, laughing eyes. Alexander's hand rested lightly on the photograph, as if it were too precious to grip tightly, too fragile to hold without breaking. Without warning, Alexander spoke. She died on a day like this. His voice was raw, a rasp dragged from a throat unused to confession. Emily froze, unsure whether he was speaking to her or to the ghosts of his own memory. "The rain," he continued, staring at the unlit fireplace. "The roads were slick, the carriage overturned. She and Henry were trapped inside." Henry. The boy. Emily's throat tightened. Alexander's fingers curled into a fist, trembling slightly. "I was supposed to be with them," he whispered. "I was late. I thought I could catch up." A harsh, broken laugh tore from his lips. "I never caught up." Silence fell again, thick and impenetrable. Emily stood there rooted to the spot, feeling the weight of his grief like a physical force pressing down on her chest. He had lost everything. Not just a wife, not just a child, but the very pieces of himself that made life worth living. And in their place, he had built this house of cold walls and locked doors, a mausoleum for a life he could never reclaim. "I should have died with them," Alexander said, so softly Emily almost didn't hear it. Tears blurred her vision. For a long moment she didn't know what to do. She barely knew how to breathe. Instinct, deep, human instinct, urged her to step forward, to close the distance, to offer something, anything, to ease the pain that carved hollows into his soul. But she hesitated, because she knew that grief like his was a beast that devoured kindness. It did not want saving. It wanted to suffer. And yet, slowly, Emily stepped closer, until she stood just beside his chair. She said nothing. Did nothing. She simply stood there, a silent living presence in the heavy gloom. And after a moment Alexander turned his head, just slightly, and for the first time truly saw her. Not as a transaction, not as an obligation, but as a soul, as someone who might, somehow, understand the language of broken things. They stayed like that for a long time, two strangers bound by invisible threads of sorrow, neither daring to break the fragile moment with words. Outside, the rain continued to fall, drumming against the windows like 1,000 tiny heartbeats. Inside, for the first time since Emily had arrived, the mansion breathed differently. Not with anger, not with despair, but with something new, something fragile, something dangerously close to hope. The rain had stopped by morning, but the house remained heavy with sorrow. Emily moved through the halls with a new awareness, as if some invisible veil had been lifted. She had glimpsed Alexander's pain, raw, unvarnished, and it clung to her now like a second skin. But his sorrow was not the only burden haunting these halls. Emily carried her own, and it was becoming harder to pretend that she could shoulder it silently forever. Late one evening, after another hollow, wordless dinner, Emily found herself once again wandering the shadowed corridors. Her bare feet padded softly across the cold marble floors, her nightgown trailing like mist behind her. The house was quieter than usual, not the natural hush of sleep, but the breathless stillness of something waiting to break. Drawn by some unnamed force, she found herself back before the forbidden doors, the ones she had dutifully avoided until now. One in particular caught her eye, an ornate wooden door with intricate carvings worn smooth by time. Without thinking, she reached for the handle. To her surprise, it turned easily beneath her touch. The room beyond was small, a forgotten bedroom tucked away in the mansion's spine. Dust coated every surface, but beneath it all, Emily could see traces of what once was. A child's rocking horse, a cracked music box, a tiny pair of leather shoes lined neatly against the wall. Her heart twisted painfully. This had been Henry's room, the boy from the photograph, the son Alexander had lost. Emily stepped inside, her movements reverent, almost afraid to disturb the sacred sadness hanging in the air. The bed was still made, the quilt faded but lovingly stitched with patterns of stars and ships. The walls were decorated with hand-painted murals, a forest, a castle, a sea full of adventure, dreams that had never been lived, life that had been stolen. Without warning, the dam inside her broke. Emily sank to the floor beside the tiny bed, pressing her forehead against the rough wooden frame as sobs racked her body. She cried for Henry, who never had the chance to grow up. She cried for Alexander, who had lost more than any heart should be asked to endure. She cried for herself, for the girl she used to be, for the riverbank days and the dreams she would never reclaim, for everything that had been taken, for everything that could never be again. Her tears soaked the dust and floor, silent witnesses to grief too long buried. When the sobs finally subsided into quiet, trembling breaths, Emily wiped her face with the hem of her gown and looked around the room once more. Amid the abandoned toys and faded memories, she realized something profound. Pain like this did not simply disappear. It didn't fade quietly into the background. It stayed, twisted and alive, feeding on silence and darkness. And the only way to survive it was to face it, to name it, to refuse to let it define you forever. A soft sound startled her, the creak of the floorboards behind her. Emily turned, her heart leaping to her throat. Alexander stood in the doorway, his face unreadable in the dim light. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then his eyes dropped to the tiny broken world she had stumbled into. Pain flickered across his features, sharp and raw. "I told you not to come here," he said hoarsely. Emily rose slowly, wiping the dust from her hands. "I'm sorry," she whispered. But she didn't step back. She didn't flee. Instead, she met his eyes, truly met them, with a quiet strength she hadn't known she possessed. "I just—" she faltered, then found her voice again. "I wanted to understand." The silence between them stretched, taut and trembling. Alexander's shoulders sagged, a man crushed under the unbearable weight of memories too heavy to carry alone. "I don't want you to understand," he said, almost a whisper. "Not this. Not them." His voice broke on the last word. Them. His family. His entire world. Emily took a small, careful step forward. "I know you don't," she said softly. "But maybe you don't have to be the only one who remembers them." A tremor passed through him, so slight it might have been imagined. For a long moment he just stood there, breathing heavily, staring at the room as if it were both a wound and a grave. And then, without warning, he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading down the hall, leaving the door open behind him. Emily didn't follow. She stood in the center of Henry's room, surrounded by the echoes of a life interrupted, and made a silent vow. She would not be another ghost trapped behind locked doors. She would find a way to live, truly live, even in a house built on broken dreams. For herself. And maybe, someday, for Alexander, too. The next morning Emily woke with a clarity she hadn't felt in weeks. The mansion still loomed dark and cold around her, and the air still carried the faint scent of dust and grief. But something inside her had shifted. A spark. A decision. She would not let herself wither here, silent and invisible. If this place was to be her world, then she would leave her mark on it, even if only in the smallest of ways. She started with the conservatory. The wild, forgotten rosebush had stubbornly clung to life despite years of neglect. It deserved a little help. With a small pair of shears found tucked away in a storage closet, Emily began carefully trimming away the dead branches. Her hands worked slowly, reverently, cutting back the decay to give the living parts room to breathe. She carried water in a battered watering can she found abandoned behind the kitchen. She knelt in the dirt, her dress stained and her knees bruised, but for the first time her heart beat with purpose. Hour by hour, leaf by leaf, the rose bush began to breathe again. It was a small rebellion, a quiet one, but it was hers. Later, when Mrs. Hathaway found her kneeling in the dirt, she frowned deeply. "The master doesn't like things disturbed," she said, her voice sharp with warning. Emily looked up, her hands muddy, her cheeks flushed. "I'm not disturbing," she replied gently. "I'm restoring." Mrs. Hathaway's mouth pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing more, only turned and left, her footsteps unusually heavy. It wasn't approval, but it wasn't outright opposition either. And that was enough. The next day, Emily moved to the library. It broke her heart to see so many beautiful books forgotten, their pages curling with dampness and time. She spent hours dusting the shelves, writing toppled volumes, opening windows to let in the thin, reluctant sunlight. As she worked, she hummed softly, an old song her mother used to sing while kneading bread, a melody woven from hope and home. Her voice filled the library's hollow spaces, gentle and human. The mansion, which had for so long swallowed every sound in thick, mournful silence, seemed almost to listen, almost to breathe differently. Days passed, and Emily's quiet rebellion grew. She placed fresh-cut wildflowers in small vases scavenged from dusty cabinets, setting them on tables and window sills. She relit fireplaces that had long gone cold, chasing the chill from one room at a time. She found old linens, washed them by hand, and hung them to dry in the faint spring sunlight, filling the halls with the scent of lavender and soap. Every act, every small gesture, was a defiance against the sadness that had ruled the house for too long. She wasn't trying to erase the grief. She knew better than that. She was trying to remind the house, and herself, that life could still grow here. That light, no matter how faint, could find its way through even the thickest walls. One afternoon, as Emily arranged a small vase of violets in the entrance hall, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find Alexander standing there watching her. For once there was no coldness in his gaze, only something softer, something wary, something wondering. His eyes fell to the violets, delicate, stubborn things blooming against all odds, then rose slowly back to meet hers. "You've been busy," he said, his voice low. Emily smiled, a small, tentative thing, and shrugged. "I had to do something," she said simply. He studied her for a long moment, as if trying to understand a language he hadn't spoken in years. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. But Emily noticed, with a flutter of unexpected hope, that his steps were a little slower, a little less heavy, as if, for the first time in a very long time, Alexander Thorne was not walking away from something, but maybe, just maybe, toward it. That night, as Emily lay in her bed, listening to the wind rattle the old windows, she smiled to herself. It was a small victory, a fragile, tender thing, but it was hers. And tomorrow she would find another, one step at a time, one heartbeat at a time. Because she wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living. The days grew warmer as spring crept hesitantly across the land, painting the barren gardens with the faintest strokes of green. Inside the mansion, the transformation was slower, but it was happening. The fireplaces Emily lit stayed burning longer. The flowers she arranged remained fresh and vibrant on windowsills and tables, and Alexander watched it all from a distance, silent and unmoving, like a man standing on the edge of a river, uncertain if he should dare to wade in. One morning, Emily found herself once again in the neglected conservatory. The rose bush she had rescued was blooming. Not fully, not yet, but tiny buds had begun to unfurl shyly against the backdrop of twisted vines. Life, stubborn and beautiful, insisted on returning. She knelt before it, brushing away the last of the dead leaves with careful hands, a soft smile playing at her lips. It was there, while she worked, that she heard footsteps behind her. Not hurried, not heavy, measured, curious. She glanced over her shoulder and found Alexander standing just beyond the threshold. He looked different, not softened exactly. He still held himself with that rigid, practiced control. But there was a hesitation in his posture, a question in his eyes. He looked not like a master surveying his property, but like a man searching for something he had long ago given up believing he could find. "You did this," he said quietly, his voice rough with something he couldn't name. Emily straightened, brushing the dirt from her hands. "I just helped it remember how to live," she said. For a heartbeat, silence stretched between them, thick with unsaid things. Then, to Emily's astonishment, the impossible happened. Alexander smiled. It was small, barely more than a soft curve at the corner of his mouth. Tentative, awkward, fragile, but it was real. It lit his face in a way she had never seen before, pulling back the shadows for one precious, unguarded moment. And Emily's breath caught in her throat. Because in that instant, he wasn't the cold, unreachable man who had bought her freedom. He was just a man, broken, wounded, but still capable of feeling, still capable of hope. He crossed the threshold slowly, stepping into the warm, dusty light of the conservatory. His gaze moved over the room, over the struggling flowers, the wild vines Emily had begun to tame, before settling back on her. "You remind me," he began, then stopped, frowning slightly, searching for words that had long since fallen out of use. "You remind me of what it used to feel like before." Emily said nothing. There was nothing she could say that wouldn't shatter the delicate bridge forming between them. Instead, she offered him a simple, honest smile, the kind that asked for nothing and promised everything. And for the first time since she had arrived at Thorne Manor, Emily felt something deep and thrilling stir in her chest. Not just hope, not just survival. Connection. Later, sitting in the crumbling garden courtyard, Emily turned her face up to the pale spring sun. She thought of the boy Henry and the woman in the photograph. She thought of the sorrow that filled every corner of this place like mist. And she thought of the man who, despite all of it, had smiled at her, even if only for a breath. Pain didn't simply disappear. Loss didn't simply heal. But perhaps, with time and patience, and the stubborn, relentless insistence of life itself, they could learn to live again. Together. Spring unfolded fully around Thorn Manor, transforming the world outside into a symphony of green and gold. Inside, the changes were quieter, smaller, more tentative, but no less profound. Alexander no longer avoided Emily. He no longer disappeared into silent corridors at her approach or drowned himself in dusty solitude. Instead, he remained, present, watching, listening, as if he were learning, slowly, painfully, how to be part of the living world again. And Emily bloomed alongside him, not with wild, reckless abandon, but with careful hope, the kind that knew how easily joy could shatter and chose to love anyway. They spent their days walking the overgrown gardens together. At first, in silence, companionable, but cautious. Then, gradually, words trickled into the spaces between them. Alexander told her about the house, about its proud, crumbling history, about his parents, long gone, about the woman he had loved, not perfectly but fiercely, and the son who had carried all his dreams. Emily listened, her heart aching for all he had lost and all he had locked away. In return, she told him about her village, about the river she used to swim in, about the books she had read under the apple trees, about the simple, perfect dreams she had once dared to have. They shared not grand declarations, but the small, vulnerable pieces of themselves that mattered more. One afternoon, as they sat together beneath a willow tree heavy with spring blossoms, Alexander broke the easy rhythm of their conversation with a sudden, raw question. "Are you happy here?" The words hung between them, trembling with fear and longing. Emily turned to look at him. His face, usually so composed, so impenetrable, was open now. Wounded, hopeful, terrified. He wasn't asking as a master. He was asking as a man who desperately needed to believe he had not ruined the last fragile thing entrusted to him. Emily didn't answer right away. She closed her eyes, feeling the breeze brush against her skin, smelling the scent of earth and rain and wildflowers. Then she opened her eyes and spoke the truth. "I'm not unhappy," she said softly. It was not the same as saying she was happy. It was not the same as saying she was whole. But it was honest. And it was enough. Alexander looked down at his hands, strong, scarred, restless, and drew a slow, trembling breath. "I don't deserve kindness," he said. "Not after everything." Emily shifted closer, her heart aching with the unbearable tenderness of the moment. "You deserve a second chance," she whispered. He looked up then, really looked at her, and for the first time Emily saw a glimpse of the man he might have been before grief had hollowed him out. Gentle, fierce, loving. Her hand found his, hesitant, trembling, and to her surprise, he didn't pull away. Instead, his fingers closed around hers, careful and reverent, as if afraid he might crush the fragile hope between them. The moment stretched, golden and breathless. They were two broken souls, stitched together by loss, bound by something deeper than obligation or gratitude, bound by a fragile, unspoken love, a love that asked for nothing, promised nothing, but simply existed, raw, trembling, and real. That night, as Emily lay awake beneath the soft weight of the patched quilt, she traced the shape of his hand in her mind, the warmth of it, the silent strength, and she realized something profound. She was no longer a prisoner in this house. Not truly, because love, even broken, hesitant love, was the only key that could open doors she hadn't even known were locked inside her. And whatever the future held, she would not face it alone. Spring melted fully into summer, and with it, something inside Thorn Manor shifted for good. It was subtle at first, like the slow unfurling of a wounded creature daring to step into the light. The halls no longer echoed with endless silence. The fireplaces remained lit without needing to be coaxed. The gardens began to bloom, wild, unruly, beautiful. And within all of it, at the fragile heart of it all, Emily and Alexander grew too. No longer strangers orbiting each other out of duty. No longer two broken things resigned to their loneliness. But something else. Something infinitely more precious. One evening, after a long day tending the garden together, Emily stood barefoot on the cracked stones of the courtyard, watching the first stars blink to life in the dusky sky. The soft hum of the summer night surrounded her, the chirr of insects, the faint rustle of the ivy against the walls. She felt him approach before she heard him. Alexander, still cautious in his steps, still wearing his grief like a second skin, but reaching for something beyond it now. Reaching for her. "Emily," he said softly, his voice low and trembling. She turned to him, her heart beating with that quiet, certain ache she had come to know so well. There was no grand speech, no elaborate promises, only a man, flawed and hurting, standing before her with his heart in his hands. "I have no right to ask anything of you," Alexander said, his eyes glistening in the starlight. "Not after how I brought you here. Not after what this house has done to you." Emily opened her mouth to protest, but he shook his head gently. "But still," he whispered, stepping closer, "I find myself asking anyway." He reached out, hesitant, reverent, and cupped her face in his rough hands. "You were given to me like a possession," he said, his voice breaking. "But you are not mine. You are only yours." Tears welled in Emily's eyes, her heart swelling so painfully she thought it might break open right there. "And if you choose to stay," Alexander said, his forehead resting lightly against hers, "it will not be because you must. It will be because you wish it." For a long, breathless moment they stood there. Two souls, bruised and battered by life, held together by something far stronger than circumstance. Love. Not the love of fairy tales or grand gestures, not the love born of easy days and perfect words, but the love that grew from survival, from forgiveness, from the fragile, stubborn act of choosing each other again and again, even when it hurt. Emily closed her eyes, letting the moment sink deep into her bones. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "I stay. Simple, unbreakable, true." Alexander let out a shuddering breath, and when he pulled her into his arms, it was not with desperation, but with a profound, aching reverence. He held her like a man who had finally found something he thought he had lost forever. And Emily, wrapped in the circle of his arms, felt it too. Not ownership, not obligation. Home. The days that followed were not perfect. There were still moments of sorrow, of pain, of memories too heavy to bear. But there was laughter now, too. There were soft kisses stolen in the conservatory, quiet dinners filled with tentative conversation, long walks through blooming gardens where old ghosts were finally laid to rest. Together, they built a life not from the ruins of the past, but from the quiet, stubborn hope of the present. From strangers bound by circumstance, to soulmates bound by choice. And though the world outside would never know the full story of the girl who had been given away, and the man who had once forgotten how to live, within the walls of Thorn Manor, they wrote their own ending. Not with grand proclamations, not with gilded promises, but with every small sacred moment that said, "I see you. I choose you. I love you. Always."